repatriation flights are continuing to bring stranded Australians home, putting pressure on the hotel quarantine system. Passengers touching down in Darwin are housed in the Howard Springs facility. Natasha Files is the Health Minister there, and she joins us now from Darwin. Natasha Files, welcome. So what's the number of returned overseas travellers in quarantine there in the Territory now, and how has that increased over the past few weeks?
We've got 340 returned Aussies in the Howard Springs facility. These are Australians who were inadvertently caught up in London and India. And so working with the Commonwealth Government and Qantas, they've been repatriated to Darwin where they're being cared for and monitored in that facility, as you said, at Howard Springs.
Yeah. And before them, had there been other overseas travellers, or had it only been people from interstate who were spending time in quarantine in Darwin?
So the Howard Springs facility, for your viewers, is a former mining camp that is just on the outskirts of Darwin. It's quite a modern facility. It's got cabins with a balcony. It's got large, open areas. And so it actually has suited the quarantine purpose quite well. It was first used to repatriate Australians from Wuhan and off the Diamond Princess. Then the Northern Territory government's been using the facility to care for people that have been quarantined from hotspots within Australia. But we've worked with the Commonwealth. It's got a huge capacity, around 3,000 beds out there.
So is this 340 you've got there at the moment, they're the first that have been there since the start of the pandemic from overseas?
Correct. So the 340 repatriated Australians, plus there's 500 people in a different part of the facility. And that, as I was saying, how large the facility is, we're able to separate it into areas. We've also got areas set aside for if the Northern Territory was to see any outbreaks, we could utilise that. Yeah. So it's quite fit for purpose in a pandemic situation.
And so the 500 people in a separate part now, those people just from other parts of Australia who are doing a bit of quarantine there?
Correct. So those 500 were, Sydney-siders. Then the Sydney side hotspot was lifted, and now that's just those people from Melbourne metropolitan.
Yeah, right. So how many of those 340 overseas travellers in Howard Springs at the moment have tested positive in recent weeks in the Northern Territory? Because those numbers have been jumping pretty significantly in New South Wales over the past couple of weeks. Like today, just mentioned then 6 overseas travellers tested positive in New South Wales hotel quarantine.
So we've had around half a dozen that have tested positive to the virus, but what we've worked with Qantas and DFAT is people have been screened before they've boarded these flights. A couple of days before, they're screened, and they're also screened as they board the flight. So we've tried to eliminate bringing the virus in, but this is why these people are in quarantine. We need to get them home, but we know that they've been in high-risk destinations, and so that's why we've worked with the Commonwealth Government to get them into this facility. So we're keeping them safe, but we're also keeping Aussies safe.
Yeah, and so around 6 of those 340 there in Howard Springs at the moment have tested positive for coronavirus. How are you handling them? Do you kind of separate them from other people once they've tested positive? How does it work?
So anyone, as I explained, they're screened before the flight. They're also screened as they arrive into Darwin. They arrive on the Air Force side of the Darwin airport, so there's no interaction with commercial passengers, and then they're taken out to Howard Springs. They're cohorted into smaller groups, and so then if someone does test positive, they immediately go into isolation in a different part of the village out there, and then we can watch the cohort that they have been mixing with. So it's a highly, the process around it is very strict to prevent infection spread.
Yeah, and so what are the lessons to be learned from what happened in Victoria?
So the Northern Territory system, we're set up here. We have the Territory Controller, which is our police commissioner. We stood it up right at the pandemic. We almost treat it like we treat a cyclone, but this time it's a public health crisis from that perspective. But we've been working with AUSMAT, the National Critical Care and Trauma Response Centre. The members of that team are AUSMAT, and so they have been through, as I said, the Wuhan evacuations, the Diamond Princess. So we've had practice, and so that's why we've been able to safely welcome these 2 flights. And there's 4 more flights scheduled through November. The first cohort will leave quarantine this Friday. That was the London flight that arrived. And then next week we'll start to see more arrivals.
Yeah, and so one of the key issues in Victoria was the use of private security in the hotel quarantine setup. What's your setup with security there at Howard Springs?
So we have the facility, it's isolated itself, and it has private security at the entry and exit. But we have Australian Federal Police and Northern Territory Police working with these clinical professionals. It's an open air facility. There's no lifts, there's no corridors. So already it's set up to deal with this type of virus better than, say, a hotel. So we've certainly learnt the lessons from Victoria, but we've made sure that there's strict processes in place to care for these individuals, but also keep the broader community safe.
Yeah. And Natasha, just on a different issue, what do you make of the pressure brought to bear by some federal politicians on some states and territories to open up more than they have?
It's really difficult. Australia as a nation, we're so used to freely travelling, particularly the territory Darwin. You know, people are from all over Australia, and so it's been absolutely devastating, the fact that people haven't been able to freely travel, and we've certainly felt it in our community. But each jurisdiction's making decisions based off the advice from their Chief Health Officer, who of course are coming together at AHPPC. So we've followed the advice of our Chief Health Officer. It's kept Territorians safe. We've had no community transmission to date. But we're certainly watching this virus overseas. We're not out of the woods yet.
And so as far as you're concerned, so should some federal politicians back off when it comes to pressuring states and territories? And you're considering what's happened with the endorsement of the Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk with her return with the election over the weekend there in Queensland.
I think every jurisdiction has different factors that they're evaluating in making these decisions. So I'm focused on the Northern Territory. We've certainly protected our community, a very vulnerable population. As I said, that work is continuing. And we've also had the opportunity through the Howard Springs facility to repatriate, hundreds of Aussies, and that will continue over the coming months to try and get these people home.
Yeah, and just finally, you mentioned, 4 more flights expected through November. You're expecting you're going to have to deal with, a fair few more positive cases?
The system we're building, that people will come in on these flights, we'll try, as I said, with all that pre-screening to avoid bringing people that are infected in. But the system is being set up like they are infected, and that way when they do test positive, we can care for them and also care for the other individuals and the broader community.
Yeah. Okay, Natasha Files, thanks so much for talking to us from Darwin.
Thank you.